Whether you're looking to make a full career out of this, or maybe just wanting a little extra spending money to support your gear or plug-in habit, if you're watching or listening to this podcast, then chances are, on some level, you're wanting to generate income from production music. Well, as it turns out, there are a lot of moving parts that go into getting paid when your music gets used on TV. And while we may sometimes get upfront cash when our cues are picked up, as production music composers, the vast majority of the money we make will depend on back-end royalties. Enter PROs. PROs, or performing rights organizations, exist to act as a bridge between us and those who want to use our music. So on this week's episode of the 52 Cues podcast, I thought it'd be a good idea to examine the role of PROs, what they do, how they operate, and how they determine how much you get paid. What is happening, everybody? This is Dave Croft, and welcome back to another episode of the 52 Cues podcast, a weekly podcast dedicated to all things production and library music, where we talk about industry topics and take deep dives into the different aspects of being a working production music composer. Plus, we feature a cue written by a member of the 52 Cues community, and this week we're going to be taking a listen to a stomp clap cue written by Lenny Beh, so you definitely want to stick around for that. If this is your first time here, welcome. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the audio podcast on the go, I want to thank you for spending part of your day here with me. I also want to give a huge word of thanks to the family, friends, and patrons of 52 Cues who help keep the podcast, the channel, and everything going. You see, we are 100% community supported, so you're not going to hear ads for mattresses or meal plans. But if you want to learn more about how you can help support 52 Cues and also unlock extra perks like live streams, workshops, Zoom feedback sessions, and a ton more, then be sure to click on the links in the description or stick around, because we're going to be talking more about that a little bit later in today's episode. So, PROs, or performing rights organizations, these are bodies that exist all over the world, usually by territory, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But they make sure that the people who create music, me and you, are compensated fairly whenever their works are used or performed publicly. Now, performance means different things, and we'll unpack royalties here in just a little bit and talk about mechanicals versus sync licenses and sync royalties and performing royalties. But anytime your cue is performed or used, now for us, that usually means television or even film or commercials, but it also means, a live performance at a bar, or if your ukulele cue gets picked up on the radio and is broadcast as a single, then that would fall under PROs. And so they're really, really important. And if you're looking to collect royalties, you do need to join a PRO. You have to join a PRO. And in general, you can only be a member of one PRO at a time, especially in a given territory, because there's a lot that goes into managing your catalog. There's a lot of data that gets moved around and a lot of tracking that has to happen. So when you sign up for a PRO, you are essentially kind of signing into their program. And to remove yourself from the program can be a little bit of an ordeal. You actually, when you leave a PRO, you have to resign, and PROs have narrow windows of resignation. I think for ASCAP, I think it's in September, you have like 1 month that you can resign, and then it doesn't go into effect until January. And moving your catalog from one PRO to another is an ordeal. So it's important to pick a PRO that works best for you, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what we're going to be covering today: what do PROs do? Kind of how they work. What's the deal with royalties, sync royalties versus license mechanicals versus performing royalties? What about cue sheets, and understanding how that whole process works, and then talking about the 10 most common PROs around the world, because you don't actually have to live in the territory. Well, I'll come back to that there are some caveats about where you should sign up and what PRO you should join. So what do PROs actually do? Well, they're kind of five things really that they do. First of all is copyright protection. They make sure that your cues are covered. Now, they're not managing the copyright, but they absolutely keep an ear out for your music and making sure that your music isn't used in violation of copyright. You might have heard stories of like folks from ASCAP showing up to bars, and if that bar hadn't paid their ASCAP license for live performances, then they could fine them an exorbitant amount of money. I know that also a lot of churches are in danger of violating these licensing agreements, because churches, in order to play the music that they play, on stage and the worship songs and all of that stuff, they actually have to pay a license to perform those. So that latest song by Matt Redman or Bethel Music or whatever that you're really, really feeling, better make sure that your church is paying a license to perform that. And so the fees for being in breach of copyright from the PROs can be, especially for like small venues and small bars and those types of things, can be shutting you down large. So anyway, that's not, but that's one of the things that PROs do. And so by helping protect copyrights of the rights holders, they also monitor usage. So if something gets placed, they monitor that, and then they will collect royalties from the organizations like a bar or like a network or a production company. I know that CBS pays licensing fees to the PROs every year, and we're talking a lot of money, especially in the live sports, to be able to use those cues live. Now, using them live versus using them in a pre-recorded segment, that's those licensing agreements are a little bit different. So it's not that, CBS has just blanket license to use any piece of music anywhere, but live, the usage can change, which is why when they drop like a Black Eyed Peas song in the middle of a live football game, they haven't necessarily worked out a licensing or a sync deal with the producers or with the songwriter. But if they were to use a Black Eyed Peas song in a pre-recorded segment, then they would have had to have used. Again, it gets a little complicated. I said there were a lot of moving parts. So they collect royalties. Organizations pay into PROs, and then they distribute royalties. And we'll talk a little bit here in just a moment about how they distribute, because it can be a little challenging, because at the end of the day, it's a trade secret. Nobody really knows the math behind the algorithm. But again, more on that here in a second. And then finally, advocacy. They advocate, they help legislation, they help make sure that, your government leaders are hearing issues that affect us as composers, as songwriters. They will lobby on our behalf, much in the same way that the Production Music Association does. They have their ear to the ground of issues that affect production music composers, and the PROs have their ear to the ground when issues come up that could affect songwriters, composers, and authors. And so that's what the PRO does. Helps with copyright, track usage, collect royalties, pay royalties or distribute royalties, and then they advocate for us on a government level. So how does it all work? Well, anytime you have a track that gets published to a library, and that library pitches it, and it gets used on TV, or it gets used to be in a show, again, whether it's live or whether it's not. Well, in order for the royalties to get tracked, then that cue has to be registered with the PRO. Now, for the most part, in fact, I think wow, like 99.9% of my cues have been registered to the PRO by the publisher, especially a publisher who is going to assume copyright, which is generally with an exclusive publisher. They want your cue in their library, they copyright it, they claim copyright, they get the publisher's share, and you get the writer's share, but they take care of posting or registering your cue to the PRO, which is great because it's data entry. It's along the same lines as metadata. Not my favorite thing to do. I don't necessarily enjoy doing it, and I've done it so infrequently that I would, if I were to be asked to do it right now, I'd have to relearn how to do it. So I haven't registered I think maybe like 2 or 3 of my own cues, and I do a little bit of publishing for some other composers, and I've registered those. But anything that goes to a library, in my experience, they register those. So if you're thinking right now, I need to join a PRO and I need to register all my music, don't. If anything, especially if you're going to pitch it later to another library and then they want the copyright, then that could gum up the works. So I don't register. Just same with registering copyrights. So music gets registered. Then the PRO issues the license for that to the different networks or whatever. Production companies, networks, they might make deals with them, and it might be more of a blanket thing, and it might be adjusting the rates and all of that. And then the PRO tracks those performances by usage of cue sheets. Now we'll talk more about cue sheets here in a minute. Cue sheets get tabulated, sent to the PRO, and then the PRO will pay out to their composers from the royalties. So they collect a bunch of royalties from all over the sources. They get a big, giant pile of money. And then, using the cue sheets and the usage and the tracking and everything else, they say, okay, Dave gets this much money, and Bob gets this much money, Jill gets this much money, and you get your statement. You get your payout, usually every quarter or every 3 months. How much do you get paid? Well, like I said, that's kind of considered a trade secret, and nobody that I've ever talked to really knows the real math, like the formula that goes into how much you actually get paid. But I do know that there are generally 3 main categories, especially as production music composers. Try to keep, again, PROs cover wider licensing than just film and TV, radio, live performances, bars and clubs and all that stuff. So we're not really necessarily talking about that. So let's stay focused on production music. It's 3 main factors, right, or variables that go into the formula to figure out how you get paid. First of all, the type of play. Meaning, is it a featured placement? Is it a theme music? Or is it background? Those are essentially kind of the 3 categories. Different PROs will give different codes for these, but essentially you have a theme, you have featured placement, or you have a background placement. Theme would essentially be title cards, title music, theme music, that type of thing. That is considered a theme placement. A featured placement would be a placement that gets used with little to no dialogue in general. Again, these are generalizations, and each PRO, especially in the US, treat them a little bit differently, and then, looking internationally could change as well. But again, these are the the broad strokes. So featured would be more prominent, less dialogue in the front. Anytime you have maybe a song that gets placed at the end or closing credits where it's just featured, then that would be a featured placement. And then the rest of it, and the majority of my experience in production music and my placements are background, which is just bed underscore music behind dialogue. There's action, everything happening on, whether they're baking a cake or whether they're, recapping a bad date gone wrong or something like that, right? That's background. The majority of what I do, fits into that category. Every now and then, something will get used as a feature, and but those are the three types of play: theme, featured placement, or background. So that's the first variable. The second variable is length of play. How long does your cue get used? If you're getting, a 30-second placement, that's going to pay more than a 10-second placement. So length of play, very, very straightforward. And then third, and these aren't necessarily in any order, it's just how I made them in my notes, is the audience, the ratings, good old-fashioned Nielsen ratings. And how many eyeballs are watching this? That plays a big part in the formula, in the metric to determine how much you're getting paid, which is one of the main pain points with streaming, and why streaming royalties so far have paid like pennies to the dollar. And as popular as streaming is, as many subscribers as Netflix, Hulu, Apple TV, Paramount Plus, all of those channels, all of those platforms have, they pale in comparison to good old-fashioned network air. In the US, that would be NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox. Those are still paying much higher than streaming. And I think part of that is that the streaming companies are famously tight-lipped about their actual statistics. They're not being forthright with forthcoming, I should say. They're not being forthcoming with the actual ratings, which makes it impossible for the algorithms, which have been used for decades in the PROs. I mean, PROs go back into the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s. So we're coming up on like 100 years. CSAC started in the 30s. We're coming in up to 100 years of that. And so this all really depended on a little bit of transparency in the reporting, but the streaming companies aren't. And so the algorithms, the formulas are kind of breaking down, which is why we need the PROs to advocate for us, to lean on legislation and legislators to make sure that the streaming companies pay their fair share. Right? It's really tough to hear about a show which gets tons of air and everything, but getting really like I said, pennies to the dollar for the usage. The flip side of that is network ratings are determined by audience sampling. Like they can't really tell how many eyeballs watched a thing. All they can do is send out like Nielsen like kits and all of that. Still doing this. Here's your $5. Will you track and log what you watch, how many people watched it, how long you watch? I mean, that's been a thing for decades and it still exists. And so they extrapolate from that sample set, they extrapolate the number of eyeballs statistically who watched it. And so even that is kind of an honor system. But audience size plays a big factor. So we have type of play, length of play, and audience size. Those are the three components that go into figuring out how much you get paid. And my understanding is, and I have zero data to back this up because this is all really closely guarded secrets to the PROs, is that the different PROs will weight things a little bit differently. The broad strokes. ASCAP puts a heavier weight on type of play. So if you land a theme song, you are likely to get paid out more if you are with ASCAP. BMI, being Broadcast Music Incorporated, their whole thing is a broadcast air audience. They will put, in general, a heavier weight on audience, which means that if you get Super Bowl play, you might get paid more if you were with BMI than you were with ASCAP. And then finally, length of play in the US. There are 3 PROs: ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. CSAC, in my experience, tends to put a little bit more of a weight on length of play. And so getting a longer play might net you more profit or more royalties from CSAC. Again, we'll unpack each of these here in a minute. But those are the broad strokes, and that's how you get paid. It's frustrating that we actually don't know the real math that goes on. It is kind of an honor system, and it's not ideal, but it's the system we got. And so all we can do is continue to advocate for transparency. We can continue to just trust the system and go from there. Because like I said, it might not be the best system, but it's the system that we got. So let's talk about the types of royalties. And we're not going to dig super deep into this. This isn't like a Donald Passman level deep dive into the music industry, but because we're talking about royalties, I think it's important to unpack the 3 types of royalties that get used, that get discussed. And the first type of royalty is a mechanical royalty. And this is paid to the songwriter whenever a copy of their song is made, usually to the copyright holder. So when a song is recorded onto a CD, when a song is streamed on a platform like Spotify or Apple Music, or downloaded, that's the idea, right? That could be a mechanical royalty. The really blurry line is Spotify mechanical or performance royalties? And it gets a little fuzzy. Like if you're able to download, well, like Pandora is a performance royalty, whereas Apple Music and iTunes is a mechanical royalty because you are downloading them. And it gets kind of confusing. Just think about, can you listen to this offline? Then you're looking at mechanical royalties. And mechanical royalties are owed to the songwriter, the copyright holder, and these royalties are managed by mechanical rights organizations. So if you've ever wanted to cover a song and you had to contact an agency like Harry Fox here in the US or MCPS in the UK, that's a mechanical rights organization. This is not the purview of production music, generally. Generally, it's not. Now, some production music libraries will put their things up into Spotify and you can download them and buy them and all of that. And that gets into mechanical royalties. But you're not necessarily looking to get a ton of mechanical royalties from production music, because we are focusing on performance royalties, which is anytime your cue is performed or placed or used publicly. So whether it's performed live, like see the bar bands or that churches using worship music, or if it's used in radio, film, television, whatever, that's considered a performance, which parenthetically was one of the reasons BMI even came into existence, is because back in the 40s, ASCAP was arguing about what a performance really was. Was a recorded medium considered a performance? Some people said yes, some people said no. BMI came about. Actually, a ton of songwriters quit ASCAP. They boycotted ASCAP. They started hemorrhaging. ASCAP started hemorrhaging songwriters, and they started their PRO. And then fast forward a few years later, and ASCAP finally was like, psych, just kidding. Nope, come on back, everybody. We'll make sure that live performances and radio or other types of performances are considered performances. It's really small, large history in a very small nutshell there. So that's performance royalties, and those are handled by PROs. So your backend royalties, we're thinking performance royalties, not mechanical royalties. Think streamed, used publicly, placed in a show, that kind of thing. And then the other type of royalty we have is a synchronization or a sync royalty, sometimes called a sync fee. The term royalty, I feel like, is a little confusing because it's not handled by a rights organization, whether it's mechanical or whether it is performing rights, the two main royalties, even though you might see it called a sync royalty. I think of them as sync fees. They are paid whenever a cue is used or synchronized with media. And this includes, and generally, whenever a song is used in film, TV, commercial, or a video game, or online, or whatever. And these are actually handled by the copyright holder. It might be the library and the organization using it. Could be a network or whatever. So PROs, MROs don't factor into this at all. So if Discovery Channel wants to use your song as in credits, then that gets into sync licensing. Library music, generating backend performing rights, or organization royalties, that's not necessarily sync music. And I see the term sync get used kind of liberally, whether here on YouTube, I even hear my students talking about it. But sync in the library music world, in the production music space, and to music supervisors, sync fee usually implies much more of a one-off type of a relationship. It's not getting access to a catalog. They're not paying sync fees to the catalog. They're paying maybe a licensing fee to use the whole catalog or portions of the catalog. But that's not generating sync fees, even though technically it's getting synchronized. In the industry, sync fees and sync royalties mean something a little bit different. And generally, especially to the publishers and libraries and music supervisors and music managers that I've talked to, generally mean songs. Because songs don't always live. A library might not necessarily, not a library, a production company might not necessarily subscribe to a catalog of just a bunch of songs and then pull songs. Generally, the songs, and not being a songwriter, I have more limited experience in this, but I'm just going off of my discussions with libraries and publishers and everything. Those are pitched a little bit more one-off. And so it might be that, hey, we have a show and we need these types of vocal songs, might be also called vocal ups. And so they will use or get a song that really, really fits that scene and then cut a sync fee for that. If that makes sense. I feel like I confused myself. If that makes sense. Again, I see the word sync licensing get used a little bit more liberally than I think it really means to, decision makers out there, even though as library and production music composers, we are making music that gets synchronized. I just want to clarify that. And then, not to be confused also with licensing fees or consideration fees. So if your cue gets used in a catalog, if it gets added to a catalog, you might get an upfront payment for that. That is also called a consideration fee, sometimes called a licensing fee. I've even heard it called a buyout, even though buyout can mean different things in different contexts. Buyout could mean we get all the rights and you get no back end, and here's a dump truck full of money. Or I've heard it used as consideration fees, which aren't sync fees, nor are they royalties. Lots of moving parts, like I said, and a lot to keep track of, which is why I wanted to do today's episode. So consideration fees are more rare in the production music space. I think it's growing. I want to believe it's growing. And I would say probably a third of the libraries that I work with, or a third of the projects and albums I've done, have had some kind of consideration fees. But in general, it's no upfront and it's all backend. It's all backend royalties. So that's the royalty space. understanding that we live as production and library music composers, generally in the instrumental music space. We're going to live in that PRO, the Performing Rights Organization space. All right, so how does your music get from your computer to money, to cash shows up? Either you get a check or a direct deposit. Well, you write a piece of music, you send it off to the library. The library has a relationship with different music supervisors and different production companies or whatever. They pitch your music gets selected. And once your music gets selected, whether it's live, if it's like a sports thing, or whether if it's during the production, enter the cue sheet. And the cue sheet is the linchpin to this whole system working, and is why it takes so long to get paid. I mean, it can take anywhere from 6 to 9 to 12 months from your cue getting air to money showing up in your account. It could take that long because cue sheets factor in. Now, what a cue sheet is a document, a spreadsheet, right, that tracks all of the data about your music as it gets used. Things like the title, things like the composer, are there any splits, things like the publishers and how the publishing is split, the IPI number, so the number that's associated with you, the IPI number, and that stands for something that completely escapes me right now. The IPI number is essentially your composer identification. It's like the social security number, but it's for you as a composer. And every composer has one, every publisher has one, and the cue sheets track that, tracks the splits, the percentages, the length of play, the type of play, what PRO they're used, what episode it was used, what show, what season. Cue sheets track all of that. And it is a lot of data, a lot of data. For example, in a 1-hour show of unscripted TV, which generally means 42 to 43 minutes worth of actual programming with commercial breaks and all that. So let's say 45 minutes. Out of 45 minutes, you might have 40 minutes of music placed. 40 minutes of placement. That's a lot of placement. And that 40 minutes isn't just 4 cues. It might be up to 100 or more cues. And that's just one episode. Now imagine a full season, 20 episodes of something. Now imagine you're a company like Discovery Channel and you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shows in progress, in production at any given time. Does the math really start showing up? You get a picture of how much information is being slung around. And to make things more difficult, the different PROs have slightly different data points that they are collecting. They might use different codes and that. There's generally some standardization, but the formatting might be a little bit different. And if you're talking about using tracking cue sheets for live performances, that's all handled in real time by, I'm assuming, a production assistant or an intern or somebody's poor job to track all of that. So if you're talking, a 4-hour broadcast of a golf, 3-hour broadcast of football, a ton of cues are getting used. And the cue sheets track all of those things. So they get all tabulated, they get all collected, and then the cue sheets get sent off all to the PROs. I had a cue sheet from an episode of Bachelor in Paradise. And I think I was the only CSAT composer on there. So CSAT got a cue sheet because of me. I think everybody else was ASCAP or BMI, which is fine. It's totally great. And so the PROs absorb all of this information, all of this data. And yeah, you could say in this day and age, with technology and especially with like AI and all of that, shouldn't it be faster? Maybe, but I think it's easy to lose perspective of just how much data is being slung around here. A lot of data. I think it gets faster. I think it will get faster over time, but they're absorbing so many data points, and then they put them all in, and everybody's data goes into a giant pile. And then, and the pile then goes against the giant pile of money they received from all the licenses from CBS and Discovery and everybody who all pay their ASCAP, BMI, CSAC licenses every year. They get a big pile of money. And they say, okay, Dave Croft had, out of our total placements from all of our composers, had this fraction of a percent. And so we're going to cut Dave a check for a fraction of a percent from the total money pool. That's essentially how it works. They get a big pile of money, they get a big pile of data, and they correlate that data to the money and then pay out every single quarter. And that takes time. And that's assuming it's always right. And Q sheets aren't always right. And Q sheets could take a long time to come in from the production company because they're being run by human beings who are in the middle of doing all of the busy stuff that we all do, right? And just like, our least fun part of the job is like filling out metadata. There's somebody over there, a music supervisor or whatever, it's probably their least fun part of the job is filling out Q sheets. It's vital. Metadata is vital, but it's not that glamorous, and it just takes time. And so using the metadata, using the Q sheet and determining from the Q sheet the type of play, the length of play. What they don't have is the audience size. They don't have the actual ratings. But the Q sheet will determine who gets what, the performing, the rights splits, author share, publishing share, how it's all split up. The Q sheets will tell that. It gets pushed into their little algorithm, and then they cut you a check every quarter. That's how Q sheets work. I wish it was more transparent. I wish they told us specifically, but again, it's kind of an honor system. It's honor system getting Q sheets. It's an honor system making sure they're accurate. And this is where services like TuneSat can be an advantage, in that you can compare your TuneSat placements to your Q sheets. So yeah, you can find in TuneSat, if you throw up some Qs, and you can know within a week whether that got air, right? Which is really cool. It feels really good. It's very validating. And we had an episode on TuneSat that you can check out. We'll put a link there for you. But 6, 9 to 12 months later, you would have to compare that TuneSat with the Q sheets from the PRO. And that is equally unsexy, line by line, I guess with a ruler. It can be really, really tedious. A lot of really tedious work. A lot of tedium to this whole industry that it was well beyond the fun part of actually writing the music. And then what happens if you find a discrepancy? Then you're going to your PRO or maybe to your publisher. And this is something that, having a publisher who's holding the copyright, they're the ones who registered it with the PRO. The good news is that if your statement is borked, then you don't necessarily have to be the one to go fight with the PROs, who are then going to go fight with the production companies to try to get accurate Q sheets. And so if we give our PRO a TuneSat, or if we give our publisher a TuneSat data, then they're going to hit the PRO with that. And the PRO is going to say, well, we need the Q sheets, because if it's not on the Q sheet, it's not happening in your statement. It's not happening when you get paid, which I think is the fundamental kind of speed bump with using and really depending on TuneSat. And I do know I heard from folks in the comments from that last TuneSat video that there are PROs around the world who actually take it very, very seriously. And I even think somebody mentioned that ASCAP has something like that. Anyway, you can check out that video on TuneSat. But your publisher can advocate for you. My lowest royalty check has been 41 cents. And that was kind of devastating, but because there were errors in it. There was some underreporting, some incorrect cue sheets, obviously. And so I was on the phone with my publisher because remember, the publisher is getting half of the royalties, right? And so if I got a 41 cent check, then they got a 41 cent payout for my portion as well. So yeah, and they took care of it. Within 2 weeks, I had a updated check from the PRO because the PROs, they're just people. They're not big, giant, conglomerates. They're human beings doing the best they can. And so always, yeah, anytime something like that happens, I always try to kind of hold out positivity and trust that it's just an error. So that's how cue sheets work. And then finally, I want to talk about the 10 most common PROs that you're likely to find. I'm going to show you the website for the 2 largest, but they are essentially divided up by territory. And for the vast majority of the rest of the world, there was only 1 PRO per country or per territory. Usually it's country. And that's because for most of the rest of the world, PROs are government agencies with government oversight, making sure that the PROs are paying out fairly and that creators are treated fairly and all of that. But the US has to be a little bit different. So the US actually has not 1, not 2, but 3, and even a 4th one whose name is escaping me right now. It's kind of there, but there are essentially 3 in the US, and they are ASCAP, BMI, and SESAC. ASCAP is the oldest American PRO. It stands for, and I have it here, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. And I actually have the ASCAP website right here. ASCAP is free to join. It's free to join, and it is the oldest US-based PRO, and they have, I think, the most users. I think they have the most composers, at least in the US. I started out with ASCAP. They will frequently run workshops, events, really, really good. Their website is fantastic. Tons of resources. I'm glad I started with ASCAP because it was a really nice place to start from a complete newbie. And the second largest in the US is going to be BMI, or Broadcast Music Incorporated. Like I said, I gave you a little history lesson. BMI came about based on a boycott of ASCAP back in the 40s because ASCAP refusing to pay royalties. And so BMI is also free to join as a composer, as a creator. And my recommendation is, if you are, this is not legal advice, but just my recommendation. If you're looking for sync music and sync placements, and if you're looking for production music, if you're looking for film, TV, those are the types of performances you're going to get, then BMI might be the better choice for you. Not necessarily always, but BMI. If you are as a songwriter and maybe performing live, and you will be holding the copyrights and those types of things, then ASCAP might be the best choice for you. I'm glad I started with ASCAP. I probably would have shifted over to BMI had I not been invited to join SESAC. SESAC, or the Society of European Stage Authors and Composers, started out originally in the 30s. They're actually the oldest PRO functioning in the US, even though ASCAP is older as a US-based, but they started in the 30s as a European PRO decades ago, moved into the US, and is It's actually invite only. They are looking for composers who are already, doing something in the industry, already have placements. It's a considerably smaller group, smaller support system, but that also means that, I have, the cell phone number of like the A&R person with CSAC. I could call up my rep today. She would take my call. I'm not sure I could easily get somebody on the phone with ASCAP. There's strength in numbers over at ASCAP. There's the support system. There's the networking events. There's the scholarships. There's the awards, the resources, workshops, all of those things. But for CSAC, they're not necessarily offering those types of benefits because they're not necessarily looking for people on the front nine of their career. I don't want to say front nine. Just, you have to be invited, and generally you have to be sponsored. And so I had my publisher with CBS sponsored me to join CSAC. It was because CSAC puts greater emphasis, in my experience, on length of play. I found that I wasn't getting Super Bowl air. I wasn't getting featured placements, but what I was getting was longer plays, especially on golf, like the Waste Management Open, on a hot June or May day, on a Saturday. So I was getting longer plays, but these weren't these giant rated shows. It wasn't, the NFL playoffs, but it was consistent and it was longer plays. And so CSAC is for profit. And neither ASCAP or BMI or CSAC are government agencies, meaning they're not actually run by the government. Interestingly enough, ASCAP and BMI do have some congressional oversight. I think there's a committee that kind of, handles it, but it's not a government organization, much like you find in the other parts of the world. So those are the top three in the US and the top three in the world, determined based on the scale and the reach of the organizations, meaning like their influence in the industry, the size of the territories that they serve. Those are the three largest. Interestingly enough, you don't have to be a US resident, a citizen, to be a member of ASCAP or BMI or for CSAC. They're based in the US. But you don't have to be a resident or a citizen to join these US PROs. And if you're getting much more air in the US, it might benefit you to join one of these PROs. I know of composers who live in Switzerland who joined ASCAP because they are getting much more airplay from US. Now, all that having been said, if you have international play, you can absolutely get paid for those. You can get paid if your music gets used in Switzerland or Germany or Japan or whatever. You can get paid, but it might take a while. And generally, the royalties are going to be split because the royalties are collected in Germany, for example, from GEMA. We'll talk about GEMA here in a second. Collected by GEMA. GEMA takes a little split and then sends the rest of the royalties off to the US PRO. And so international royalties might get shaved off a little bit. So I know in the US, you don't have to be a citizen in order to join the PROs. For some of these other territories, like the next biggest one is going to be SOCAN, which is Canadian, which is Society of Composers, Authors, and Music Publishers of Canada. SOCAN. Canadian PRO, the fourth largest based on territory and scale and reach. And I'm not sure if you have to be a Canadian citizen to join SOCAN. For the UK, you're looking at PRS, or PRS for music, which is Performing Rights Society for Music. Yep, leave it to the UK to just, it is what it is. Nothing like American Society of Composers. No, it's just like, it's a Performing Rights Society for music. Yes. So PRS for music, that's based in the UK. GEMA in Germany, and I'm not going to even pretend to pronounce these words. It's been like 11 to 12 years since I was, speaking German on the regular. So I'm not going to pronounce it, but that is the German PRO. SACEM or SACEM from France, SIAE in Italy, JAZRAC in Japan, which that stands for the Japanese Society for Rights, Authors, Composers, and Publishers in Japan. And then APRA, the Australasian Performing Rights Association. That would be Australia and New Zealand. All right, so those are the top 10, again, based off of scale, reach of the organizations, influence in the industry, and the size of the territories they serve. So whichever one you choose is up to you. As a composer, most of these are free to join, meaning you just sign up. You don't have to pay any annual dues. I know once upon a time, ASCAP had dues. I think BMI did, but I know in the US, they're free. I don't pay any dues to CSAC, but again, it's kind of invite only. So I even looked on their website. There's in the FAQ, wasn't even a, how can I join? It was just like, yeah. So yeah, I would not have, CSAC wouldn't have been on my radar if I hadn't been invited to do that and to join that. For these others, there might be some fees associated. I'm not sure. Digging into these, it was kind of tough because even with English translation, but check out the PRO in your territory and see if that's going to work. Now, as a publisher, then that usually does involve a fee, because once you kind of work through your career, then you're going to find yourself needing to enter into the publishing side of the business. And if you're publishing, or if you're putting music on non-exclusive libraries that aren't taking the publishing share, then chances are you're going to need to set up a publisher's PRO, and that does get into money. And as a publisher, you actually need to register for each one, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, especially if you're representing other composers. Like, it's a little bit beyond what we're talking about here. So at the end of the day, you do need to register with the PRO. It's vital that you find one that works for you. Find one, whether it's by your territory or the type of placements that you're looking at getting, and join them. Don't go registering all of your works, but you do need to join a PRO. And it's never too early. Back in the day, you used to have to prove to ASCAP. Like when I joined ASCAP, I had to have a public performance of a work before they would take me. And it wasn't until I was in my master's program at the University of Memphis, and I had a public performance of one of the jazz tunes that I wrote. That was a public performance, and then ASCAP took me. Now that's been going on 20 years now, but now you don't have to do any of that. You don't have to prove a public performance. You just sign up and go. So there's really nothing stopping you from joining a PRO. But what about you? What's been your experience with your PRO? Which PRO are you with? Have you left a PRO? Have you ever resigned from a PRO? And what was that process like for you? I know when I left ASCAP and went over to CSAC, it was easier to leave that music in ASCAP than it was to try to extract my entire catalog and move it over. It was early enough in my my career, and my catalog was thin enough that it was easier to do that. And every now and then, I'll get one or two plays from those cues, which are still administered from ASCAP, even though I'm not actively adding any new ASCAP cues to my catalog. But I would love to hear from you. Please let me know. I do read all those comments and would love to hear from you. So we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to hear from Mrs. 52 Cues, Shannon Croft, who's going to tell us all about how you can join the community. And when we return, we're going to be checking out a stomp clap cue written by 52 Cues community member Lenny Beh.
Hey y'all, I'm Shannon Croft, and I want to tell you that the 52 Cues podcast is made possible by viewers and listeners just like you, composers and producers who are looking for a better way to connect and collaborate. You see, 52 Cues isn't just another website selling static, pre-recorded videos to a mass audience. It's a fun, vibrant, and positive community that comes together online for sharing cues, getting feedback, and discussing what's up in the production music industry. You'll find both personalized feedback and live interaction, which are the best and fastest ways to grow your skills and earn more placements. The best part is that the 52 Qs community is absolutely free. And when you're ready to take your career to the next level, we offer friends and family subscriptions which unlock weekly live streams, live interactive group feedback sessions, monthly interactive workshops, and more. Head over to 52qs.com and sign up today. And while you're there, check out our personalized feedback videos, private lessons, and of course, merch. I can't wait to see you at 52qs.com.
That was Power Through It by Lenny Beh. Thank you so much for sending that along. By the way, I think I said Leonard right before the break. Sorry if I felt like you were in trouble using your, Leonard, but really appreciate you sending this along. This was sent along during our week 20 weekly feedback threads. We put weekly feedback threads together every single week. So stomp clap. First of all, the claps sound absolutely great. The energy of this, the vibe, I think is absolutely on point. And I feel like the stomp and the claps, the drums are really, really working. Here at the beginning, the guitars feel a little mono-y, and I was prepared to say widen the guitars, but later, we bring some really nice wide guitars, but I'm wondering if we should double the guitars a little bit earlier there. Yeah, it feels a little mono-y, a little boxy throughout here, and I feel like it took way too long to get a nice wide, fat guitar sound. Do watch your ceiling. Yeah, I am showing that we are getting into 0-0, which isn't, completely catastrophic, but Our peaks are hitting 0, and generally we want, like, I don't go any higher than minus 0.2, and I generally spend most of my time at minus 1. So I would set those peaks. You want to make sure that nothing's passing through the limiter, the mastering limiter, and you don't want to clip. You don't want to clip the output bus. And so also, speaking of drums, I think we could use more cymbals. We had some cymbals coming up a little bit later, but I feel like at the beginning of every phrase, you could absolutely have a cymbal right there. Yeah, again, I felt like we needed a wider guitar image right here. Maybe some doubling. And I do feel like it's a little long. We're at over 240, pushing 245 or so. Unless this was specifically for a brief that wanted a longer, around 2 minutes. And so I would trim it up a couple of different ways. The first way, I think we can get to business a little earlier. I think we could probably start kind of right here. We could probably go. I love that fill. That's a really nice solid fill. Boom. So that's one way. So we already trimmed off about 10 seconds. And then I would go one time more through that and build it. So maybe instead of that type of an edit, maybe we put more energy at the. Now I'm having second thought, because I do like it 2 times through. I do like it 2 times through the beginning there, that opening phrase. It just feels a little. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not. What would happen if we only, I'm going to switch tools here. What would happen if we only did 1 time through this B section? By the way, the transients look really, really great. So from an editing standpoint, I'm like, okay, I can really see where these edits are. Like, I can clearly see that in this spot, that's where the phrase changes. I can look and see that the density of the waveform, it just looks thicker here than it does through here, and that makes from an editing standpoint, that makes it really easy. So I'm going to try. What would happen if we took out? So I'm going to cut from there. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's skip to that. So essentially, I took out the middle phrase here. It's not the cleanest edit, and you would do this in the session. I don't know if that's the right edit, but the idea is to pull out 4 beats here in the middle. Oh, we actually need to go to boom to that. And you go to that chord right there. Let's see how that would sound. All right. Don't mind me while I just edit your track. I'm just trying to make it sound as clean as possible and overlap the transients here. So let's zoom in. Let's see how that would sound. Oh, that sounded even worse. Let's try that. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Let's check it out. Now go back to the A. And I don't think you need to hit this downbeat. I would do this. So we have, so coming off of this big section. And what would you think about adding like a ooh, like a little vocalization, like distortion and everything, really far back in the mix? Just add a little extra beef. So this is all working? Yes. And another instance where you hit a downbeat, you essentially created an extra bar that I don't think you need. I think we could go in and just trim these out and go straight into your down section. You see how the energy just keeps flowing forward? And then coming out of that. So coming out of this down section, do a reverse. Yeah, I don't know if I would hit the downbeat. Let's see. Yeah. And I wouldn't play the downbeat here. I would go, gong, 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 gong. Yep, I would trim it like that. So we have this. Boom. Yep. That's how I would trim that. So you can see what we're doing is we're just tightening up this arrangement so that it just keeps forward momentum. All right, so backing up to the beginning of this section. See how there's no stall in energy? It's all pushing forward. I would add another layer here, chunk riser. Fantastic button. Nice ending here. Yeah, really, really nice job. Like I said, the mix itself feels a little... like if I'm looking at the bottom end, we don't have much really below 60 hertz, 30 hertz or so. I feel like that can be a little bit better defined, probably in your bass, because right now the drums are just kind of rumbling around down there. And so that could be a little bit, I think we could boost that a little bit more. Of course, we have the fall off here over 18K because of the MP3, but really nice work, and power through it. That title is absolutely spot on. Nice work, man. Thank you so much for sending this along. Like I said, this was sent along during our week 20 weekly feedback threads. We put feedback threads together every single week, and right now we are collecting cues for week 21, and I will be choosing one of these cues to feature during next week's podcast. And if you liked that breakdown and if you thought that feedback was helpful, that's something that I offer over at 52cues.com/coaching. I offer video feedback that I will unpack your cue, look at the form, structure, title, mix, melodic, all the harmonic structure, all of that. So if that's something that you would like done for your cues, head over to 52cues.com/coaching. And while you're there, you can also check out my other coaching services, such as one-on-one Zoom sessions and our quarterly mastermind group. So again, 52cues.com/coaching. But that's going to do it for me this week. You absolutely want to tune in next week, where I will be talking about burnout. Oh yes, I know, I feel you, right? Where you burn the candle at both ends, and eventually that candle gets so thin that you can burn yourself out. Overcommitting, under-delivering, all of those things. And so we're going to talk about burnout, things that we can do to help avoid it, and talk about some of my self-care practices. But again, that's going to do it for me. As always, a huge word of thanks to the family, friends, and patrons of 52Cues who help keep the lights on. Thank you so much. Know that I love and appreciate every single one of you. So I hope that your week 20 went well, and I hope your week 21 is going even better. And just remember, friends, no matter what happens, wherever you are in your career, just know and trust that the universe has amazing plans just for you. Until next time, peace. The 52 Cues podcast is copyright 2023 818 Studios, all rights reserved. The music played on the podcast is copyright of their respective owners and is used with permission and for educational purposes only. For more information, including joining the community and submitting your cue for consideration on the podcast, head over to 52cues.com.